Look at the shrinking value of your paycheck. Look at the national debt ticking past $35 trillion. You are not witnessing a random economic cycle. You are witnessing the inevitable repeating act of financial self-destruction that has destroyed every great empire in history. It is a single fatal flaw in statecraft that bankrupted Spain, demolished the financial dominance of the British Empire, and is now being executed at an unprecedented scale against the US dollar. This is not about complex derivatives or market crashes. This is about a choice, the deliberate decision to substitute real wealth with printed credit. The single mistake is believing your political power can indefinitely override your financial reality. The outcome is already written in the ruins of the past. The only question is whether you are ready to read the 500-year warning before it hits your retirement account. To truly understand the danger facing the English-speaking financial world, we must go back to the first global superpower that mastered the art of overspending on an imperial scale, the Spanish crown of the 16th and 17th centuries. This was an empire literally drowning in real wealth. From the mines of Potosí, an endless, unimaginable flow of silver, the Rio de Ocho, anchored global trade from Manila to Madrid. If any empire had the fiscal right to spend, it was Spain. But the sheer ambition of the crown was even greater than its supply of silver. To finance endless wars in the Netherlands, to uphold the massive fleets needed to project power across oceans, the crown chose the easy path. It borrowed. It borrowed against the future shipments of silver. It borrowed from Genoese and German bankers. It borrowed against the assumed permanence of its own God-given power. The Spanish leaders, arrogant in their resource wealth, began to believe they were exempt from the laws of arithmetic. This was the first fatal instance of the single mistake. The consequence was inevitable and spectacular. Between 1557 and 1647, the Spanish crown declared national bankruptcy a staggering 6 times, 6 defaults by the empire with the world's greatest source of hard currency. The system cracked because the future silver, when it arrived in Seville, was already collateralized, already gone, promised years in advance to finance the current war. The debt became a vicious cycle. Each default shattered the confidence of the bankers and the merchants, plunging Spanish finance into chaos, but the crown would simply reorganize the debt and borrow again, doubling down on the fatal flaw. The mistake was not the borrowing itself, it was making the borrowing a permanent way of life, convincing themselves that their wealth was infinite, and therefore debt was harmless. This is the first lesson of the warning. Even empires stuffed with gold or silver can drown in debt if they choose to make political ambition the anchor of their finances instead of discipline. The second and even more insidious version of this mistake comes from a much older source, one that perfected the art of the hidden tax: ancient Rome. The modern financial crisis is not new. It is merely a high-tech version of the same trick used by Roman emperors more than 1,700 years ago, a trick the English-speaking world later mastered. Rome's economic backbone was the silver denarius, a coin trusted across the known world for centuries, but faced with crippling military expenses and the political difficulty of raising taxes, the emperors chose the silent alternative: inflation. They began to secretly debase the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius and replacing it with cheap copper and other base metals. The coin looked the same, but its intrinsic value was slowly being hollowed out. By the mid-3rd century, a coin that was once nearly pure silver was a bronze disc with less than 5% silver, a financial lie coated in a thin wash of precious metal. This debasement was the original single mistake, the choice to fund current liabilities by quietly destroying the value of their currency's foundation. This isn't abstract history. It was a brutal tax on ordinary Roman citizens. Savings evaporated. Soldiers paid in increasingly worthless coins, revolted. Merchants stopped accepting the currency, preferring barter or honest gold. Local economies broke down because the government had killed the trust in its own medium of exchange. The government, in a panic, struck cheaper and cheaper coins, hoping volume would replace value. Rome didn't just fall because of barbarian invasions. It fell because its currency collapsed from a relentless internal financial corruption. The Roman solution to debt was simply to lie about the money. The genius of the emerging English financial system, the one that would replace Spain and evolve out of the shadow of Rome, was not that it avoided this mistake, but that it perfected it and institutionalized it. The British elite observed the Spanish spectacular defaults and the Roman internal rot, and resolved to build a system that made debt permanent, profitable, and politically sustainable. This transition is the most crucial lesson for the modern US dollar crisis, because the Anglo-American financial blueprint is its direct descendant. The watershed moment came with the creation of the Bank of England in 1694. The Crown, perpetually needing money for war, formalized a permanent relationship with a central bank. Wealthy investors bought government bonds, funding the Crown's ambitions. The trick, the refined version of the ancient mistake, was this. The government guaranteed those interest payments using the taxes collected from the general population. This was the invention of perpetual national debt. It was a structured system of wealth transfer, disguised as legitimate national finance. The wealthy elite were guaranteed secure, steady returns on their capital. The ordinary working person paid higher taxes, on salt, on soap, on every necessity, to fund those interest payments. It was a transfer of wealth from the laboring majority to the financial elite, a financial trick that allowed Britain to fund its global empire indefinitely. Debt was no longer a temporary contract, it was the very base of state power. Britain took the Roman debasement, replaced the physical adulteration of silver with the structural debasement of currency via debt expansion, and fused it with the Spanish ambition for perpetual spending. The British pound sterling became the anchor, but it was anchored to debt, not just gold. This was the shift from real assets to debt-backed promise. The British system taught the world that a nation could grow powerful by borrowing as long as it never defaulted, and as long as it could convince the world that the promise was as good as the underlying wealth. This perfected mechanism allowed the British Empire to dominate the 19th century and laid the precise, unavoidable blueprint for the current crisis facing the US dollar. Every step taken by the modern Federal Reserve and US Treasury is a page taken directly from the Bank of England's playbook, now executed at a scale the 17th century bankers could only dream of. The mistake simply changed clothes for a new century, becoming more sophisticated, more efficient, and far more pervasive. The stage was set for the dollar's rise and ultimately its reckoning. If the British system was a slow poisoning, the US dollar's trajectory was a final explosive betrayal. The Anglo-American power structure inherited the financial throne, but it inherited the single, fatal mistake with it, the belief in infinite credit. The ultimate result of this 500-year-old error is not just abstract economics. It is the price of your groceries, the cost of your future, and the silent theft of your life's work. The system is designed to break, and the breaking point is now here. The US dollar inherited the mantle of global finance in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, post-World War II. It was established as the new global anchor, but it kept the ultimate restraint of the past, the promise that $35 could be exchanged for 1 ounce of gold. This was the gold exchange standard. For 27 years, this system forced a kind of discipline on the US, ensuring stability and global trust. But the US, like Spain before it, could not resist the temptation to abuse the privilege. To fund massive military engagements like the Vietnam War and huge domestic spending programs, the US government began borrowing and printing far beyond its capacity to redeem gold. The US was spending gold it didn't have, writing checks the rest of the world still believed were backed by metal. The single, fatal mistake was being repeated. The nation was funding consumption and war with currency unsupported by real wealth. This overreach led to the final, total surrender to the ancient mistake. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally announced the US was permanently closing the gold window. The single mistake, funding current liabilities by severing the currency's final link to any real value, was complete. The dollar was unshackled, becoming a pure fiat currency, backed only by the full faith and credit of a government that had just broken its most sacred financial promise to the world. This 1971 decision was the final, critical step in the 500-year warning cycle. It gave the government and its central bank, the Federal Reserve, the power to spend any amount by issuing debt, knowing the Fed could always buy that debt by creating new currency. The ultimate modern act of Roman debasement. This is why the US national debt is approaching $35 trillion and growing exponentially. It is not an accident. It is the inevitable consequence of the system designed in 1971. The inflation you feel now is not bad luck. It is a silent policy, the hidden tax that governments use to pay for their overspending, stealing the value of every dollar you hold. Every citizen is paying for the consequences of a political choice made 500 years ago, perfected by the British and executed by the US. The anchor is gone. The discipline is gone. What remains is a system built entirely on the illusion of permanence. The current mountain of global debt is the shadow that looms over the future of the English-speaking world. History is brutal but instructive. Every financial crisis is a wealth transfer, from the many who trusted the paper to the few who prepared for the reality. The survivors of these historical collapses were not the ones who believed the most. They were the ones who doubted first. You must not assume the system is solid just because the authorities say so. The lesson is simple. You must minimize your dependency on the paper promises of the debt-based economy. Real wealth is not found in the digits on a screen or the promises of politicians, but in assets that retain value when the currency fails. Land, productive businesses, skills, and hard assets. History proves that money can disappear overnight, but the ability to produce, to build, and to trade real value never does. This is the only financial freedom history allows. If you understand the trap, you can avoid becoming its victim. If you don't, you will pay for mistakes you never made, all thanks to the single fatal mistake repeated for 5 centuries.